Hi, Anand.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm not complaining. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Anand, and I'm going to let you pronounce your last name.
Giridharadas.
So you make it sound easy, but it looks a little more, it looks like it would have 5 syllables. It sounds like it has fewer.
I mean, look, in every family, you end up with, if the name originated in a different script, someone transliterated it. Someone was the first to transliterate it. And everybody's stuck from then on with however that person transliterated it. So I'm stuck with a lot of silent letters. Also, that said, people have learned in this country how to say Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky. So, I think it's all a matter of time before they're able to say
Well, maybe you should write a great symphony. But like Dostoevsky, this is a good transition. You have written a great book. How's that? So you really deserve for us to invest the time in learning how to pronounce your name correctly. But let's go straight to the book. It's called Winners Take All. I don't have the book. I've been listening to it on Audible. Wow. That's what it would look like if you had it on your smartphone. Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. New York Times bestseller. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well-deserved. Very interesting. I can see why it's a bestseller because, for one thing, it offers a kind of explanation of how Trump wound up being president, where the discontent came from that led to that. It's also a critique of kind of a class of people that has a number of critics. It's a critique of capitalism. It's a critique of a lot of things, and has vivid portraits of some of the people in the class of people whom you critique. So I can see why it's doing so well. And also the questions you're raising are important. So how would you define the class of people that you're critiquing? Because it's not simple. It's not just the corporate do-gooder class, although that's part of it, right?
Right. So one of the things I learned a long time ago as a writer is just the importance of coinage. I mean, you know this because we all now use the word Nonzero, so you're a master of this. But
yeah, you're kind of hard. You're kind of hard on the idea of a win-win outcome in the book, but we can get to that, which is of course part of the non-zero sum game world. Anyway, sorry I interrupted you.
And so I became interested in trying to think about how I could, as a writer, take a lot of reality that people see all the time and think of as familiar and almost make them see it again in the way that I was trying to get people to look at it. And so I coined this idea of market world. So market world is the kind of elite that you're getting at, but it's a complex of people and institutions who are the kind of winners of our age of extreme inequality, our age of globalization, our age of the technological revolution. The people who've done well in that time, done well in many cases because of the particularities of that time, and who are determined, living in an age of inequality, to do good, to give back, to try to alleviate some of the suffering they read about in the paper, to try to narrow some of the gaps they hear about on the evening news. But who also, because they live in an age of extreme inequality, in which falling out of the very top is increasingly costly, a group of people who, when they try to take on the changing of the world, when they try to make things better, insist on doing so in ways that preserve the system that keeps them on top and predictably, reliably shuts most people out. And so the book is about those elites. It's about the institutions where they kind of cut their teeth, and that's McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, and it's also corporate CSR departments, and it's the big foundations. Of course, it's the big Silicon Valley companies that say that their very business models are changing the world, even as they build some of the most ruthless monopolies in history. By the way, I think it's no accident that, perhaps the most idealistic company in American history, Facebook, is also the first company in American history to compromise a federal election. And so we live in this age in which elites mean very well, or at least talk a good game about doing well, doing good, but often seem to be preserving the very structures that are causing the problems they claim to want to solve.
Right. So you also, I mean, there's kind of a cross-cutting milieu of kind of thought leaders, right, that you critique pretty heavily that are part of the system. You're kind of you're embracing Dan Dresner's distinction between thought leaders and public intellectuals. And thought leaders, I mean, here we're talking kind of TED Talk and, you know, doing corporate gigs, speaking gigs, and so on. And they are part of this system, right?
One of the things I found is that it's easy to think, and if you kind of lurk on the dark corners of Reddit, you may think that, you know, the world is full of these rich people who are sitting around talking about how they can screw regular people. I think the reality is interestingly different from that. What I found in my reporting is that we have a profoundly indecent system in the United States of America today that is upheld by many, many decent people. Mm-hmm. There are absolutely elites who are trying to screw us and trying to make the world a worse place. But what I found more often, and what I focus my book on, is those elites who are sincere, generally, in trying to make a difference. They're limited in their willingness to do so, but they're sincere. And so I became interested in this puzzle of how do decent people uphold an indecent system? And you need a bridge between the decency and the indecency to explain it. And the bridge, I realized, is ideas, right? Is the beliefs that you need kind of beliefs to launder good intentions into bad outcomes. Mm-hmm. Because these are smart people and they read the data. They understand, they have reason to understand that their programs are not narrowing the gap, that one charter school they support in Bed-Stuy is not, in fact, reducing, the odds that black children will have the kind of life chances they will, et cetera, et cetera. So they need to have someone whispering into their ear that no, what you're doing is good. The little charter school is good. Telling women to lean in instead of giving them social policy, that's good. You're doing the right thing. They need a reassuring voice. And that's where the domesticated animal of the thought leader comes in. Thought leader, I mean, thinker. You think of a thinker. You think of a James Baldwin. You think of a Catherine McKinnon. You think of a Gloria Steinem. You think of the kinds of thinkers who throughout history have made us look at ourselves, have been thorns in the side of power. Those kinds of thinkers are not going to give elites who want to feel like they're making a difference without changing anything. Those kind of thinkers are not going to give those elites reassurance. So instead, what these elites have done is cultivate a kind of parallel circuit of their own domesticated thought leaders, as Dresner calls them, I call them in the book, where these are basically thinkers who address the key issues of our age, who talk about these social problems, but who tend to do so in ways where they avoid the culpability of the winners. They avoid blaming them, and they avoid the kinds of solutions that would be painful for the winners. So in general, and there are exceptions, of course, but in general, if you want to be a thought leader rather than a thinker, you do a couple things. You don't frame issues in ways that emphasize the perpetrator, the people who cause the problem. You just focus on reducing the problem. So you talk about poverty, which doesn't have a perpetrator, rather than inequality, which is inherently relational and about someone having and others not. You kind of zoom in and you talk about problems in a way that emphasizes the struggles of an individual rather than systemic issues. You talk about, why women should raise their hand more if they want to get empowered, not about how we don't fund maternity leave in this country, thus creating a chain of events that drives many women out of the workforce. You kind of emphasize social issues. You recast them as personal dramas. And thinkers who learn to talk and think in this way, because they kind of give the winners of our time a kind of set of rationales for thinking that the indecent system they uphold is kind of good enough, or that they're making enough headway in changing it. They're rewarded, these thinkers, with patronage. They get the speaking gigs, they get the TED and Aspen and Davos nod, and their ideas get an amplification from the winners' networks. They often end up, speaking in venues where, as I once did at the TED conference, Bill Gates was literally in the front row of my talk.
Yeah, I noticed you have a Bill Gates blurb, right? Which, I mean, it's not, you can see that he's maybe a little ambivalent, but he did give you the blurb, right? I mean, that's quite an accomplishment for a book that is pretty much a broadside against capitalism.
And even more against the kind of elite philanthropy that he's part of. But I think there's a couple things going on there. One, I don't know why he decided to do it, and I'm grateful he did. But I think he is someone who is rich enough and secure enough that he can afford to induce people to have these conversations, because he knows the data as well as anybody else, that for all the good that people have been able to do, particularly in the developing world, America, the opportunity structure in America is so profoundly broken, and even the most well-intentioned people have been so unable to fix it, that the rest of the global order is now unraveling because of the consequences of that. I mean, at some level, there's a limitation to how much you can help countries in Africa and South America and Asia if the consequence of neglect at home and broken systems at home is that basically the entire global liberal order that upheld a certain measure of peace and prosperity around the world is collapsing. And I think that is one of the reasons why not just Bill Gates, but others have been more open to this critique than I expected, because it doesn't pull punches, as you know. But I think there's something about the Trump era that has caused many thinking people to say, you don't get a tsunami like this without everybody being a little complicit, right? If a normal president that you don't like or a little bit vulgar wins, I mean, you may say, well, that's the fault of this person or that's the fault of that system. I think for Donald Trump to win, there have to have been 18 massive uncorrelated system failures all happening at the exact same moment. And I think the Trump presidency has therefore been an invitation for many people to say, okay, what's my part in a broken country? I think, I've been thrilled not only by the way in which the people I'm really writing for, which is everybody else, has perhaps been in some way inspired to retake change from the billionaires. But I've also been inspired by the way in which some of those billionaires and people in their social world have, publicly said, look, I don't agree with all of this book or even most of it, but I'm going to use this book as a chance to rethink some of my assumptions and kind of how I show up in the world. And I, to be honest, did not expect that reaction from people. And it's been actually kind of beautiful. And I have to thank Donald Trump for so ruining America that everybody is willing to look at themselves a little more closely. What an amazing thing to come out of a very dark moment.
Do you worry that you will now become part of the kind of system of reassurance that you decry? In other words, Anand, you don't have to worry that we lack in self-criticism or that, our hearts aren't in this, because we're bringing on Anand, our pet radical, to, the fact that we hang out with him is proof that our heart is in the right place. I mean, I was at Davos a long time ago, and you know who Lori Wallach is, probably, right? A fire-breathing radical. Well, she's a big critic of globalization and at least the way it's being done. And she was kind of there, but I don't think she deeply affected the course of their behavior. Do you worry about becoming? This is a more thoroughgoing critique of these people than they're accustomed to, I think. But do you worry about becoming domesticated?
Sure. And the other day, a representative of a billionaire reached out to me for advice. And I said, I'm not here to give you advice. I did offer to do a public event with that billionaire and actually question some of that billionaire's choices, particularly in terms of political contributions alongside the philanthropy. at a public debate, that was turned down because these people don't want to debate. I'm no one's advisor or consigliere, and I think it's particularly important now that I've written this to hold that line. What I do want to do is to get a lot of people to think and read and actually see if there's some willingness to go deeper. And let's look. I mean, human beings are complicated. I'm hoping I can co-opt them before they co-opt me.
Okay, good luck. There's a lot of them. So let's get into the specifics of the critique. So it seems like broadly speaking, you're saying we cannot count on capitalism, no matter how well-intentioned some of the capitalists, to solve the problems that capitalism creates. And there's a few bullet points there. I mean, you're talking on the one hand about people who, well, first of all, you don't spend that much time on the kind of Mark Zuckerberg idea that, which is common in Silicon Valley, I think, that the enterprise I'm engaged in is inherently good. It just so happens that the way I'm maximizing my revenue is saving the world. Of course, it was easy for him to say that before we understood how Facebook was not only susceptible to various kinds of manipulation, but also just kind of naturally in some ways conducive to tribalism. Anyway, that's one thing. One thing you spend more time on.
Win-win. That's all about that.
That is about a naive kind of win-win, I think. Yeah. Another kind of bullet point is like people who have initiatives that are designed for people in need, but they're private sector initiatives. And, in other words, it's not just a byproduct of what they started out doing that it's going to help the world, but they're going to target these poor people and they're going to make some app and it's going to be available to poor people and it's going to help those poor people. And their idea is this can all happen within the market system. This will be a self-sustaining enterprise, and it'll work out, right? That's kind of a second thing. And then there's philanthropy, traditional philanthropy, where you say, well, okay, this is not in the private sector. I'm going to give money to do something that would not get done by the private sector alone. And then there's various kinds of, there are shades of gray here. There are, places on the continuum where people are like using tools of capitalism in a philanthropic way that you think is naively trustful of the power of tools of capitalism to do philanthropy. So there's a whole continuum of things you're critiquing, but does that kind of cover the waterfront?
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And all of the things you described are kind of different moments on the continuum of doing well by doing good. And they're all kind of different forms of this win-win, right? And so to take each of them, I think you have this idea, as you say, that you have a lot of in Silicon Valley, stereotypically, which is the thing I'm inherently doing. The thing I'm doing is inherently philanthropic, right? My money making is inherently philanthropic. In other words, I don't even need to do a foundation. I mean, all of that's gravy. Me doing me building my business is more charitable than anything the government or other generous people or activists could do. I think that certainly seems to be what motivates those at Facebook. I think that's a big part of Google. I think that's a big part of how Elon Musk seems to show up in the world. And I think we've heard that discourse from tech for a long time. And I think, to stick with that for a second, what's interesting there is, even if you don't dispute, Facebook gives us huge reason to dispute that. It's not true, because Facebook, as I said, is the first company in America to compromise a federal election in that way. It's also in the middle of gutting the news business. I have many friends in the media business who have sat the way you and I are sitting in a conference call right now, sat across from Facebook executives and basically been told, if your newspaper doesn't publish on our platform directly without ad revenue, and essentially giving us at Facebook the ad revenue instead of you, like, good luck if you're around in a few years. Mafioso organizations in which this company is using its monopoly power to basically bully the media out of existence, right? That's a real thing that is happening. And so in many ways, these are actually not win-wins. However, even if we stipulate that they are for a second and take the vision on its own terms, it is a vision in which simply doing more of what they do, earning more and more money, earning more and more profit, growing bigger and bigger, getting more users, will lead to getting more and more, giving more and more benefit to humanity. What that sets up, if you just project it forward with basic math, is a vision in which the concentrated power in our society and social justice will just increase in tandem to infinity. So we're going to end up with a society in which there's like 3 companies left and just so much justice. That's where that leads. And I think that just is patently absurd to obviously anybody listening to this. Let alone the fact that most of these companies are not win-wins for all kinds of complicated reasons. I mean, is Google search on its own, that product, a win-win? Yeah, it made a lot of money from that, and definitely the world is better off. You know, a few years ago, it was reported that 85 cents of every dollar of new advertising revenue in America went to either Facebook or Google. That's not just because they're smart. Mm-hmm. That's because they're de facto monopolies. Right. That is a very real way in which them doing them is not making the world a better place for you and for me and for all the children of the world. It is actually them using market power to suck the oxygen out of a competitive capitalist society and creating a world in which we may not have, or we already don't in many states, to have like reporters covering the state legislature, in which we may not have in many cities, like reporters covering the city council. We may end up through capitalism with the situation you end up with in many, communist dictatorships, which is like public officials able to do whatever they want without scrutiny. So I think these folks need to think about how does that win-win ideology actually cover up the ways in which they're sucking value out of the society and provide a smokescreen for that. I think second, you have the social enterprises you talked about, where, as you say, the idea is not, that what they do is inherently, this capitalist thing is inherently liberating, but it's actually that rich people and people trained in the tools and thinking of capitalism are kind of best qualified to take on social problems. And it's kind of the mirror image of the first. And, so that's why you have all these businesses that are like, we're going to like collect poop and we're going to turn it into recycled coffee. And then we're going to ship it in these little tote bag, whatever. And you get all these businesses that are going to make the world a better place through some clever win-win scheme of that kind, involving poop and coffee and various other things.
Hey, can I actually punctuate this with a little anecdote? I remember when I gave my TED talk, the main stage one in like 2006, I ran into these guys who had gotten some kind of like TED award, and I hope I'm not misremembering this because that would be unfair to them. But they had this bottled water called Ethos, and it was one of these things where, like, I think the deal was for every bottle you buy, they send a penny to some needy person somewhere or something. And I ran into them afterwards, and I said, that's good, but like, isn't this whole bottled water thing itself kind of like unfortunate? Like when I was a kid, we had this system of delivering water that worked like this. It came through pipes and you drank it. You didn't have a truck drive truckloads of plastic stuff to the point of purchase, after which you disposed of a plastic bottle. Seems like more, and they got kind of uncomfortable, but anyway, I digress.
The discomfort you caused is the discomfort that I am now trying to cause on a larger scale with this book. That is the precise problem. And the structure of what you identified is the problem behind many of these efforts, which is basically that people, wittingly or not, end up fighting on both sides of the war. And the way they're fighting, with the main thing they do, often actually overwhelms the good they're doing. And what's funny about these kind of social enterprises, just to stick with that for a second, is that they represent a very radical theory that in some ways is far more radical than Adam Smith's invisible hand theory, which has been the animating force of kind of laissez-faire capitalism for a long time, which is that all Adam Smith said was sort of a bit like the Facebook example, like just let rich people do them and social benefits will flow, right? Let the butcher and baker focus on their own interests and there will be bread and meat for all. What many of these kind of new, particularly the philanthro-capitalists, social enterprise people, etc., what many of them are pushing is the more radical idea that social problems are best solved by the geniuses who are able to build businesses. And so that you don't just, as a business person, need to be left alone. You need to be put in charge of our schools. You need to be put in charge of how we empower women as a society. You need to be put in charge of urban revitalization. Because you are, to put it in the terms of that philanthro-capitalism book that came out, 10 years ago this month, right during the financial crisis, and had the unfortunate subtitle, How the Rich Can Save the World, even as they were ruining it. That book referred to these people as hyper agents, right? These rich people are hyper agents. They're just more capable of doing stuff of all kinds of stuff than others. And I don't think we fully understand how radical this theory is, how much more radical it is than Adam Smith, than trickle down, than laissez-faire. This is actually saying the only people who should get to decide things are people who apprentice at Goldman Sachs or McKinsey. And it's a preposterous theory that I think even Adam Smith would have vomited a little if he'd heard. And then finally, you have this, importantly, philanthropy, which is having made money from the rather extreme form of capitalism that we practice in the United States today. You give money back to solve social problems. And again, what's interesting here is this is putting the very people who have helped architect and sustain our winner-take-all economy at the vanguard, in the forefront, in the leadership, frankly, of helping the losers of the system they designed. The arsonists become rebranded as firefighters. And that's very good for them because that gives them a perfect opportunity to avoid firefighting techniques or more importantly, an arson investigation that might point the finger at them. Okay,
but there must be versions of philanthropy that you think are doing good, right? I mean, it's certainly ironic if your diagnosis is true and that global capitalism is the root cause of the problem, and I do think it creates problems, then it's ironic that the leading capitalists are the ones who are going to save the world. But I mean, take a case like Bill Gates. Like he's very focused on diseases in countries that are poorer than the United States. I haven't looked into it, but I assume he's done some actual good there, right?
Absolutely, and I focused on the book on what people are doing in America for a reason, because a lot of these other countries, the situation is very different because they don't have governments matched to the level of their problems. A lot of these countries are countries that are destabilized precisely because outside forces and colonizers left them in a certain state. And I think there's a very different issue around kind of global distributive justice where, you could argue that some of the resources that the West stole from these societies and the problems they caused are flowing back to them. There are huge issues still about accountability and crowding out government capacity in those places, but I just think the issues are a totally different set of issues. I wanted to focus on the people who've won from the American opportunity structure, who try to give back, help improve things here in America, but who are complicated actors when it comes to improving this environment. And so, is it possible for folks to give better? It absolutely is. Look, this is a book that is, I think, a fierce book, but it's also a reported book. And it's also a book that tries to look forward to what people could do differently. And I think that I have a kind of shorthand for ways in which people could give better, a kind of two-part shorthand, which I'll share with you, which is, I think there's a kind of two shifts that rich people need to think about if they kind of want to move from the current types of giving that are dominant to the kinds of giving that might be better. Given where we are in America today, the first is to shift from giving back to giving up. Right? And what that really means is giving back is easy. Giving back is throwing a few scraps down from the mountain. Giving back is Goldman Sachs throwing, 30, 50, $100 million into some programs after, helping to cause billions and billions of dollars of damage with the financial crisis. Giving back is easy. Giving up is giving in ways that actually put your own privilege at risk. Giving in ways that pull up the ladder for there to be other rich people who made money in quite the ways you did.
So is there an example of that actually happening, the kind of giving up that you approve of?
I think if you look at, it often happens actually when rich families lose control of their foundations. So I think if you look at the Ford Foundation, which is no longer controlled by the Ford family,
right?
It's no accident that lack of control has led to the kind of most social justice and kind of root cause focused foundation. Whereas you look at foundations currently in the grips of their billionaire owners, they tend to be more palliative. When they talk about system change, they're just talking generally about size and sweep, but they tend to be less self-interrogating or interrogating of privilege. I'll give you a simple example that's forward-looking with, you have Jeff Bezos recently making an announcement about giving $2 billion to homelessness and education, right? The giving that what he announced would be classic giving back. It's helpful. It's going to feed some people. It's going to house some people. It's going to school some people. Some people will absolutely be better off because of it. But it's still giving back. It's not putting himself at risk or those of his class at risk. It's not putting the system that has benefited him or helped him build Amazon at risk. What would it look like for him to shift to kind of giving up? Well, he partly has that much money because he got lucky, not just in having a good idea, but he got lucky in starting that company at a time when labor protection was historically weak, right? He got lucky that unions were in decline. He didn't do anything to cause that to be true when he started. That was true because of all kinds of social factors and a political war on the right that had been bludgeoning unions and the shifting economy away from manufacturing and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there'd been a war on unions, and unions had also failed to stay relevant to certain shifting currents. And that meant that over the course of, and then he has, of course, accelerated that through his choices, but over the time period that he's built Amazon, he got to avail of a level of bargaining power on the part of workers that was really, really low. And I think it's hard to imagine Amazon certainly being as successful as it was and him being as rich as he was had that not been the case. I think if workers had been as powerful, let's say, as they were in, pick an era, 1940, 1960, whatever, I think you just have to write a very different history of the company's story and of his.
So what do you want him to do? How do you want him to make amends or whatever you'd call it?
Imagine if he put billions of dollars into not leading, but just putting money into those at the forefront of thinking about the future of collective bargaining and worker power, right? That is a very different kind of issue. One, it absolutely threatens his own privilege. If he were to do that, Amazon's stock would probably go down the next day, right? There's a serious initiative to give workers more leverage in America going forward.
Actually, I'm not sure the stock would go down because that would presumably wind up affecting all companies more or less equally, or at least the downside wouldn't focus on Amazon. Right. Now, if he put money into organizing Amazon's workers, that's a serious ask,
Well, but what I'm saying is to do something that would have that consequence.
Yeah.
But would not just be for Amazon, but would be for everybody, right? If he, whether it's an organization like the National Domestic Workers Alliance, an organization like Workers Lab in Oakland, there are people doing serious work to think about in the new age where unions are not white guys in Michigan at factories. That's not all they represent. In a new age where we have Uber and the gig economy and Amazon and seasonal work and all these different things that unions have not been able to fully catch up with. How do you rebuild the future of the union, and how do you push back against, essentially the jihad that the right has been waging against unions for 30, 40 years? That's the kind of thing where if you delivered, billions of dollars to that cause, and importantly did so in a way that did not increase his power over that movement, that was him lurking in the background, like putting that money there, but letting it be spent however those people wanted to spend it and those communities wanted to spend it. That's just an example of something that would be, I think would solve a lot of issues at the root and would empower a lot of other people trying to make their own solutions and trying to it wouldn't be like a primary contribution of money into politics. It would be a contribution into who has power, who has voice, and can therefore run for office, can therefore fight for policies. And I think that kind of approach of kind of training and building people up also has the approach of it has the benefit of not giving someone like that too much further power in American life. Look, any exertion of any pumping of money into this country for any kind of change is going to give these people power. And that's part of the problem here. I'd rather they didn't have as much money and therefore didn't have it to give it away, and therefore didn't end up with all these extra votes that they get in addition to their one allotted one. But I think there are ways to do the giving that at least minimize that power by working through others. The second shift that I was alluding to is, the first is from giving back to giving up. The second is from crowding government out to crowding it in. And a lot of, 100 years ago, Carnegie's a fascinating example of when he was donating libraries. I mean, look, this is a very flawed guy who did much of the same kind of extreme taking, union busting, etc., that we now talk about again today. But when he was doing some of his giving, he was interested in creating public goods. And one of the things he did was he tried to essentially think about some of his giving as being like a startup incubator for government programs, right? Where you do something privately that the government is not doing now to sort of shame it into doing it publicly from thenceforth, or to kind of train it to do a thing that you think it should be doing. And so I think some of his library contracts actually required the government to raise taxes and absorb the cost of maintenance of the library going forward. It's not because he couldn't afford the cost of maintenance, right? He would pay for the upfront costs, right? And he says, now you got to pay for the upkeep. With a relatively small investment, he's catalyzing a habit in government that, by the way, has now gone on, decades and decades and decades in a way that actually maybe his gift wouldn't have been able to. And so that kind of giving, that way of giving, where you're trying to stimulate government to do more, has fallen away. These days, I think, someone like Zuckerberg or others would basically want to create a program that does it all for themselves and has their name on it and bypasses the state. We need to get back to that heritage of using these gifts. If that money is there, which I think it should be there in lesser quantity, but if it is there and does need to be spent, there are ways to spend it that bypass government, and there are ways to spend it that actually might catalyze and increase public good. There's a couple of scholars at Stanford, Horvath and Powell, who talk about giving that is contributory to democracy, that basically enlarges the public goods provided as a net result of the giving, and there's giving that's disruptive of democracy, that basically substitutes private purpose for public purpose. Mm-hmm. And I think it's more important than ever to shift more of that giving from being disruptive of democracy to contributory.
Okay. So now this is an ideological critique, right? I mean, you can imagine a kind of almost ideologically neutral critique that focused on efficiency and effectiveness, like kind of the effective altruism movement is maybe a version of that. But it would say things like, look, as far as using the private sector to do these things, there's a pretty good chance that if there were a way to make money helping these people, it would already be being done? Because there's a lot of people trying to make money. So you can imagine critiques like that, or critiques that just look at programs and say, look, this isn't helping. But yours is it's a left-wing critique, right? Both in the sense that, and one thing we haven't talked about is that you're saying that one thing you're saying is, leave aside the effectiveness of philanthropy, governments need to do more. Redistribution through the income tax system is, I gather, something you're in favor of, right?
Yeah, but I would push back against the idea that that's a left-wing critique. I mean, I think it is an attempt to restore some measure of normalcy to the profoundly abnormal state the United States is in among the rich countries because of a 30 or 40-year war on the very idea of government. Mm-hmm. I think if we were to succeed in doing some of the things that I think would be right, I don't think we would end up, I think we'd still end up being a very centrist country by the standards of rich countries. But, so I don't think it's left wing the idea that like a country this rich and complicated should make healthcare available to everybody and not have people die of cancer if they work 29 hours at Target instead of 30. That's actually not a left-wing idea. It is only in American politics right now, as currently configured, that is considered a left-wing idea.
That's what I mean. I mean, income tax redistribution, which I'm in favor of a lot more of than we have, it's a left-of-center idea in America right now.
Right. But it's
doing a whole lot of it is left-wing, and doing some of it is left-of-center. But
But we just have to understand that that's left-wing in the context of a 40-year assault on the idea of the common good, and to not allow what ideas that are frankly centrist or right of center in many countries to be kind of falsely branded as like socialistic, simply because, we're on the back foot against people who basically wish there was no government at all.
Right. So, yeah, I honestly think where I see more ideology in the book coming through is in the overall sense of just the critique of capitalism. It's like you kind of, more than once say, almost like leave aside the effectiveness of what various corporate do-gooders are doing. You want them to understand that the way they made their money is part of the problem. Global capitalism is part of the problem, right? I mean, that's fair to say that in that sense, the book has a pretty pronounced ideology, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's not global capitalism I'm talking about. I'm talking about American capitalism. And there's a difference. I do not think, I think one of the things that the radical right and free market ideologues have done is try to turn capitalism into a monolith, okay? And try to turn questioning of capitalism to a monolith. And so basically the fight becomes Adam Smith, laissez-faire, the beauty of the free market, the ballet of supply and demand on one hand, and, Stalin on the other. Right? So it's Stalin and Adam Smith, and that's it. Those are your choices. Well, the reality is capitalism, like everything else, like many things, comes in a lot of flavors, more flavors than even Baskin-Robbins. And my argument simply is that the flavor we're practicing right now is not good. Right? There are many other flavors available in the world, from Japan to China's version of authoritarian communist capitalism to a whole bunch of flavors in Europe. And I think if you were to look at the variety of flavors out there, you will find that given our wealth and means as a country, we have chosen to practice a form of capitalism that does a couple things that make no sense and violate capitalism's own values. Number one, siphon so much wealth to winners that they are able to then buy government and rig the society to be actually less competitive, mobile, and dynamic. That's not capital. Those aren't capitalist values. Those are the values of capitalism eating itself. Those are the people who've won rigging things. I mean, like there's a reason that it's not a competitor to Facebook, right? There's a reason there's not a competitor to Google. Like, yes, network effects are incredibly powerful.
Yeah, they are.
But those companies,
I was going to say that. I mean, I do think those are areas where the system tends toward monopoly, which I think is a case for government regulation. I mean, personally, but that's another matter.
But why do they lobby so much then, right? If these were all just things that were natural forces.
They lobby to prevent the antitrust regulation that they are arguably due. That's why. I mean, these are systems that naturally tend toward monopoly and should therefore be regulated, and they fight that regulation. Yeah.
Correct. And that's not capitalist. That has nothing to do with capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Like hiring former antitrust commissioners in the government to like join your lobbying outfit to persuade their former colleagues to exempt you from scrutiny that is aimed at making the marketplace more competitive is not capitalist.
Yeah.
A lot of the things I'm decrying are actually problems with too little capitalism, not too much. We don't have a real market. I mean, the great competition commissioner for the EU gave this really smart talk in which she said, in many ways, we are more capitalist than the United States is today because we believe in competition and we are willing to use the power of government to fight for every company's right to compete in the marketplace, not like 8 or 10 companies. I would also say that having a situation where, as we now do in this country, most people born on the less fortunate end of the spectrum have basically no chance, absent miracles, of having their talents discovered and their gifts realized, is not particularly capitalist. It's the dumbest kind of capitalism. It basically means GE's the smartest possible future managers out there for GE, like 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5 of them will never be found. They're there, they'll never be found, right? It means that the most genius person who could, fix Tesla's battery problems, like 2 or 3 out of the 5 of those people who would have the best mind in the country to do that are never going to be found because they may never even get to a math class that could reveal their talent. Mm-hmm. That's not particularly capitalist. It's really dumb if that's capitalism. So I am talking about a set of social arrangements that sometimes have to do with capitalism, and sometimes have to do with schools, and have to do with like the fact that women, as we're learning through the Me Too movement, need to spend so much of their lives worrying about not having their butts groped instead of the spreadsheet they're working on is not particularly capitalist. It's dumb capitalism, right? It would be much more efficient, to speak in these people's language, if women could just actually focus on their spreadsheet and not who might grope them. But these companies fight the kinds of regulations that would protect women on the job because they think they're too expensive to implement. So I think we've ended up with a set of social arrangements that make our capitalism not work for perhaps most Americans today, mm-hmm. that create the kind of outcomes where the people who cause the financial crisis are the only people who really benefit from it, along with their, rich friends, and in which, frankly, capitalism becomes self-defeating because it locks most of the future consumers and brilliant workers and inventors out of the opportunity to become the fullest versions of themselves. In other words, I think we need to think about, it's not capitalism versus socialism. It's not about which ism. It's like whatever ism you want to do, and that's America's choice democratically. Whatever ism's your ism, you might as well make the best version of that ism. And whatever ism we're living under right now, I don't think it's the best version mm-hmm. That we could have of it.
Okay. One final example of your critique of capitalism. I thought maybe you were a little hard on Cinnabons book. So there's a woman, you draw a lot of great kind of portraits in the book. One of them is a woman, comes from a hard scrabble background, pulled herself up by her bootstraps. She worked at Hooters for a while, which an institution she defends, rose to the ranks, wound up influential. What is she running? So what is her deal at Cinnabons? Is she running Cinnabons?
She's one of the top executives.
Yeah. So anyway, but I mean, just by way of fleshing out your ideology, I think she's an example of someone you want to have a reckoning and say, don't you understand that in selling this product with sugar and fat, you're harming people, right? Like, this is itself bad. This is a bad manifestation of capitalism.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess what I wonder is, like, so how do you feel about, like, people who make wine, or people, because people drink and they get in fatal auto accidents, and they abuse their children, they abuse their spouses, and that happens. I mean, most people eat Cinnabons responsibly. Most people drink responsibly, but it seems to me that's a pretty broad gauged critique. I mean, are you against, like, are people who work at wine companies, do they also need to have a reckoning?
Wine is pretty heavily regulated.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, for starters, the age that you're allowed to drink it at, the identification processes for acquiring it, doing various, there's various processes to make sure people are not drinking on various jobs. There's various processes to make sure we're not driving while drunk. There's serious enforcement of that, et cetera. We haven't, I think there are real questions about, could we do more on that or any other harmful product? But I also think, wine compared to Cinnabons, tends to, it's not an accident that tends to be more, well, let me say this, I think you look at things like Cinnabons, you're often targeting poorer people, just in terms of, just not Cinnabon particularly, but just all of the fast food and particularly high sugar, high fat food in this country, often targets those with less purchasing power, those in food deserts, those who don't have fresh produce easily available near them. And I think, pushing a product that is not good for people, and that given the social context of communities where there aren't other options, is not going to be eaten once a month as an indulgence, but is going to become a regularity for many people because of those systemic issues. I kind of expect more of people. I expect more of them as citizens. I think capitalism can't be the only value we have. I don't think we need to get rid of it. But I think we need to also have other vocabularies. And if you live in a community, you may think, because that'd be great. But you also may think, I don't want to make Bob live shorter. Yeah. And so I want to make money from Bob, but I also kind of don't want to cost him 5 years of life with his kids. So I'm going to try to not make him obese. And gosh, if I give him diabetes, I'll feel terrible, but I would make more money. And I think part of what's happened in American life as these organizations become so big. I mean, I think if I were sitting face to face with you, I wouldn't take that deal of pushing that Cinnabon on you a little harder, making a little more money and shortening your life. But when we get to these big companies, we basically, I mean, if you're in charge of Pepsi, if you're in charge of Cinnabons, if you're in charge of, any number of fast food, that your net effect of putting that product into the world is to harm people and shorten lives. That. That's why you do playgrounds to, help diabetic kids. That's why you lobby so much. I mean, to prevent, school districts from keeping the vending machines out of the schools. That you're not a hospital. Your net effect on the world is pretty bad. And, the obesity and diabetes statistics in this country, I think, would dwarf the effect that wine has, to go back to your earlier example, on creating social problems. I mean, we now are, through the power and connectedness of these huge companies, we have created, millions of Americans whose bodies betray them and who live lives considerably shorter than they would otherwise live if they were not eating food that the creators of that food know better than to give them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess one reason Cinnabons got my attention is I actually don't think they are so dependent on marketing to poor people. I mean, one of their main venues is airports. I think people like me is is their target demographic, and they've had some success. But And also, I mean, I take your point, shaming can work. Like when you have a big company like McDonald's and you do a little shaming, it will add maybe some salads to its menu and maybe discover that actually people wanted that. I don't know. And it will list ingredients. And that's worth doing. I guess part of it is I had traditionally thought that, like, you know, capitalists are going to do what capitalists are going to do, except to the extent that they are regulated. And they should be regulated.
Right. That's what I'm suggesting.
Right. You know, shaming may work, but and I do think it is what a big focus of yours. I mean, are there other, aside from income redistribution and things you might spend the revenue on, like public schools, which is kind of an egregious deficiency in the current system? Are there particularly glaring examples of policies that you just think are not happening that should?
Well, it's not just enough spending on schools. I mean, I think one of the most disgusting things about our public schools is they're funded according to local property taxes.
Right.
So that basically we give education to children in proportion to how expensive the houses are in their neighborhood.
Right.
Which is, I'm not sure it's the worst possible way to design an education system, but it's close. And so thinking about how do you get rid of that seems like a very important foundational question with education. And then you can pump more or less money into that system, and certainly we need more. I mean, the fact that I just saw a story today, I mean, teachers are, you know, taking second jobs, cleaning houses and doing second shifts in various kinds of jobs because they can't afford to teach our children. I mean, we sometimes, I think, don't see our own choices as a society with the clarity we'd see them if we were foreign travelers. These are dumb, self-defeating choices that increasingly express who we are and have shaped a society that is not dissimilar from a kind of caste society where the best predictor of where you end up is where you start. Mm. And it's not who I don't think it's who we think we are. So in terms of policies, anything to rejigger that American mobility structure and mobility system. I think another important set of ideas could be around how do we make it affordable for people to do public service. I mean, the big argument of the book in many ways is a return to the kind of public life as the place we go to change the world, right? JFK didn't tell everybody, ask not what you can do for your country, ask what business you can start, right? He was calling for people to, if you saw things you didn't like in your society, get into public life, right? It doesn't just, you can't blame Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell for not doing that. And there are 90,000 governmental entities in the United States, right? County executive jobs, all the way up. And so, I think we need an age going forward that is more public spirited, in which more young people choose to solve problems at the root for everybody through public life. And part of that happening is going to require making it less expensive to live as a young person, particularly in many of our cities. So maybe we think about, do we forgive college debt for anybody who chooses to go into public service? There are scholarships that do that privately right now. Do we do that at the level of the society, or have universities do that? I mean, Harvard, Yale, these big universities, they could afford to do that if they want. If you go into public service, the debt is wiped clean. I think that would hugely change the calculus of our brightest young people, many of them, from instead of going to Morgan Stanley and Citigroup and McKinsey, after college, possible and easier for people to do public service again.
Okay. I alluded to Trump and the relevance of your book to Trump early on. We haven't really spelled it out. Do you want to say a little bit about the connection between your critique of the system and the discontent that got Trump elected?
Yeah. Look, I think the philanthrocapitalists paved the way for him in two distinct ways. One political and one philosophical. They paved the way for him politically through all the non-solutions to real problems that they peddled for 30 or 40 years. And what that meant was, as trade was failing to work for people, many people, as globalization was failing to work for many people, as the technological revolution was failing to work for many people, instead of redressing those problems in the deep way that those problems required, because those are all deep system issues, social mobility, etc. Instead of fixing those things, they promulgated fake change. Instead of thinking about what does trade adjustment assistance look like in the 21st century that would actually make people whole and would spread the benefits of globalization to more people so that you didn't have so many people wanting to shut it all down. Instead of doing that, they first of all just rich-splained to everybody that trade was great for everybody and what they were experiencing was not really what they were experiencing. And that, they could go to this charter school, or they could go to this little program, or they could go to, get a free course online from Salcon, and all would be well. And so the philanthrocapitalists and these kind of elite do-gooders in general left America's biggest problems unsolved for a long enough time that created space politically for a demagogue, a strongman demagogue outside of that system, unbeholden to a lot of those forces and interests that frankly people on the left and right are both beholden to tap into that. The same thing that Bernie Sanders tapped into by virtue of being outside some of those systems and structures. And, I think philosophically also those elite do-gooders gave Trump a lot of his language. And this is something that people don't, I think, talk about enough, which is when he says only I can fix it, like the businessman is like specially, he didn't invent that language. That came out of all these business people who've been telling us for 20, 30 years that only business people, they've managed a company. It's them who can like fix our economy, right? Mitt Romney made that case. I mean, George Bush made that case. You had, when you think about his language of win-win, right? And this idea, not language, but his practice of win-win, which is I can fight for the common man and I can like enrich myself hugely. Again, that is classic philanthrocapitalism over the last many years. This idea that like fighting for the least of us and enriching oneself were like totally compatible goals. He's only taken it to the next level where he's now pledging to be a populist who's trying to use his presidency to sell his country clubs. When he talks about, the idea of I traded with, I made my stuff in China and Mexico, therefore I can get us the best trade deals. Again, that's not new with him. That is the idea of the arsonists rebranding themselves as the firefighters. The people who cause the problem are somehow best qualified to solve it. And again, he got that vocabulary from these elite do-gooders who built the winners-take-all economy and then proposed themselves as the deliverance from it. And so I think one of the uncomfortable truths is you can't live in this era and say, well, I have my billionaires. He's a bad billionaire, or maybe not even a real one, but I like mine more, and I'm going to marshal mine against him. I'm going to run Mark Zuckerberg or Michael Bloomberg or Tom Steyer or Oprah or whatever. I'm going to run a better billionaire against a bad billionaire. I don't think that works. I think the problem is these billionaires. The problem is people who have accumulated far too much power in public life and who we've trusted for far too long to be doing what's good for us when in fact they're doing what's good for them. And we need to escape the loop of this culture that keeps tasking billionaires with saving us.
Yeah, you mentioned trade in there, which is one reason I had said, I do think to some extent your book is a critique of global capitalism. It may not be that salient, but I mean, it's commonly noted that trade has helped pull millions out of poverty in Asia and so on. And in fact, I think you note in the book that that's a common thing for people in the corporate world to kind of celebrate. But it also seems to have come at the expense of middle class, working class wages in America and so on, and kind of accentuates the sense that America's corporate elites are at least as interested in the welfare of the rest of the world as they are in Americans. And you also have an interesting thing, which is that so much philanthropy these days, and Trump's election may change this, but so much philanthropy had been directed at other parts of the world. I mean, Bill Gates and so on. Is that part of what got Trump elected? And also, is it new? I mean, you've studied philanthropy more than I have. Andrew Carnegie, as you said, he was largely focused on America. And when I think of the main kind of corporate philanthropists now, I think of all these, microloans and emerging economies and so on. And none of that stuff is necessarily bad, but it does seem to mark a change, right?
Well, I think it's a paradox, which is at one level, the problem with America has always been how provincial it is. And in some ways, it's a great achievement of the United States right. over recent decades that we've become less provincial. Mm-hmm. Our food has become less provincial. Our understanding of languages has become less provincial. Our givers have become less provincial. And you do have all these people, and it's not just the billionaires, it's also young people who graduate from college and now think I should go to Rwanda or I should go to Vietnam to spend time instead of doing whatever they might have done before closer to home. I think what has come with that, unfortunately, is a sometimes neglect of one's backyard. And I would say I certainly know a lot more Americans who've been working on issues in Kenya over the last 10 years than I do people who've been not from Kentucky working on issues of Kentucky. And I think we're now living in an era where Kenya is worse off because we were neglecting our Kentuckys. In other words, I don't think it's good for Kenya to be living in the Trump era either. I think it's destabilized the world order. It's destabilized trade. It's destabilized the security regime in its neighborhood and elsewhere. And I think actually if more of us had been, not either or, but if more of us had been concerned, as I knew so many people were, with global do-gooding, if more of us had been focused on the parts of our own country that weren't doing well, had been thinking about how to rebuild the economy and the opportunity structure and schools and political life in close to home, we might be in a situation where the whole world was better off because simply Donald Trump wasn't president. And I think that's where, it's important to remember that policy has a much bigger effect on the world than do-gooding and largesse, right? And yes, all this while we were doing a lot of donation to the world. But to the extent that any of that came at the expense of some focus on ourselves and the health of our institutions, I think the world's now way worse off because they're living in Donald Trump's, because they're living under the security and trade regimes of Donald Trump's America.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have one more question before I get there. Is there anything else you would want to say about the book or the message?
No, you've covered a lot of stuff.
Okay. The last thing is just that your acknowledgments are unusually interesting because you start them with an anecdote that I would think, I'm wondering, did any editors say, wait a second, put that in the book or put that at the beginning of the book or something? Because it's kind of a dramatic story about how you first kind of segued into looking at this set of issues. And the short version of the story is that you were very much of the world you're critiquing, right? So you want to, just quickly tell the story, and also then maybe any other reflections you have about your current status, like where you're heading. Will you still be welcomed in this milieu and so on?
Yeah, I am a writer and was invited into this kind of what I jokingly call a benevolent open secret society called the Aspen Institute as a fellow. And there's many of these fellowships around the world, and Davos has one, and there's an Obama Fellowship and a TED Fellowship and other fellowships. And they're all kind of about taking young, quote unquote, leaders and helping them be more successful at solving social problems. Now, this particular one was about generally helping business people kind of paint on a bigger canvas and do more to help the world. And they would let into every class of 20 a couple non-business people, a writer, an artist, poet, kind of spice and diversity. So I was the spice and the diversity. And it was a great experience, and we really bonded as a class of 20, and I got to know great people. I officiated one of their weddings. But as I got deeper into this kind of Aspen Institute world and went to the gatherings sponsored by Pepsi and Monsanto and sat in the rooms, funded by the Koch brothers to discuss making the world better, and sat there as, Goldman Sachs was sponsoring our summer retreat about building a more kind of fair society, I started to get overwhelmed by the hypocrisy of it and by the sense that maybe when all these rich and powerful people get together in Aspen to talk about making the world better, maybe it's not just that it's lip service or not just not helping fast enough, but maybe this is actually part of how we uphold an unjust system by just, making these kind of gestures of do-gooding and throwing up a bit of a smoke screen to distract people from the reality that these are the very people who are taking. So they asked me to give a speech several years into being a fellow. That was not unusual. There were very few outside speakers at this thing. They would ask everybody to sit on a panel, give a talk, and everybody would, in every year at these summer reunions, maybe a majority of the people would speak in some form or another. And so I had this slot, and I decided to surprise them by kind of dropping a bomb on the group and saying, look, we come here to change the world and make the world a better place, but what if we're the problem? What if we're not the solution? What if this people in this room, with millionaires and billionaires and business people and captains of the biggest industries of our time, what if we're the problem? And it caused a stir and a mix of hatred and a standing ovation and some people sitting on their hands and a lot of people confused about whether I was right or not. And the book grew out of that speech. And to your question, the reason I didn't include it, it's funny. I was thinking the other day, this is my third book. On all three books, I've reversed myself on the question of whether to put myself in it. My first book was not supposed to have me in it. And my editor, one of the editors who I talked to, said, I don't care about your idea of India is becoming your new idea of India. Tell this through you and your family. So I took this impersonal book and made it a personal book, and that transformed it. My second book, I wrote myself into it, having learned my lesson the first time, so I wrote myself into it. But I only got involved in the story 2/3 of the way in, so there was no I. And then the I appeared on page 200-something. And I sent it out to a bunch of friends to read. And virtually the one thing everybody agreed on was, it was totally destabilizing and awful when the first I suddenly appeared, 2/3 of the way in. You've broken the social contract. You can't do that. So I took it out of that book. And this book, I had it in there, the story that I started with. I actually, I think I started the book with it in one version of the book. Mm-hmm. And I decided, look, you can make any book about you because every book is about you in the sense that you're the one writing it. You're the one choosing to neglect your children to make it happen. But I just didn't want this to be a book about me. And I also felt like my complicity in what I was describing, which I felt important to talk about in the acknowledgments, was a weird and not particularly representative kind. It's the kind of, the writer hanging around in a billionaire's world is not really America's social problem today, and I wanted to focus it on the protagonists. One of the things that I've written a lot about poverty and inequality in my time, and one of the things I noticed in reflecting was when people write about broken opportunity systems, poverty, inequality, we always write about the people on the wrong end of it. We always write about the poor. And, that's like trying to understand a house by studying the inhabitants of that house instead of the architect. If you want to understand the house, you got to also interview the architect. And so I thought it was important with this book to really focus it not on me, not on you know, poor people hurt by these programs, not on, in a way, not even on the staffers and flunkies who are upholding, but on the protagonists, the very rich people who are trying to make a difference, but whose capacity to do so is limited by their own standing and effort to protect it. And I thought for once we should have a book about inequality that writes about the top, not the bottom.
Yeah, and you do a good job of not trying to completely demonize anyone, and also but I think finding some cause for at least subtle critique of everyone is just that you spend time on in the book. Maybe that's a slight oversimplification, but you don't fall into an angels and demons kind of dichotomy, which is good. So congratulations on the book. Not all books get the amount of attention they deserve. Yours is. And,
thank you. I appreciate it.
And so keep up the good work. And tell us, by the way, where can people reach you on Twitter or anywhere else you want to be reached?
Yes, on Twitter, I'm at Anand Wrights, AnandWrites. I use that on all Facebook, other platforms. Okay. And that's probably the best place to find me. My website is anand.ly, ANAND.ly.
Okay. And the book is Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. Thanks a lot, Anand.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Okay. See you.